There was something undeniably imposing about medieval castles, their stone towers slicing through gray skies, their heavy gates locking away secrets, and the promise of safety from a ruthless world beyond. But behind those majestic walls, the truth was far removed from the fantasy that movies love to sell. The smell alone shattered any illusion. It wasn't roses or noble feasts, but the stench of waste, mold, and stale sweat. Even the grand halls where lords dined were more familiar to rats than to royalty. Life inside a castle was cramped, dim, and above all, filthy. The same walls that kept enemies out also trapped the rot within. And while the legends speak of kings and queens living like gods, their day-to-day existence was far more earthly and far more disgusting. Get ready to uncover what truly lurked behind the velvet curtains, where people relieved themselves, how and if they bathed, what crawled beneath their beds, and how anyone managed to survive in a place where glamour was nothing but a crumbling illusion carved in stone and lime. Deep within the towering stone walls of medieval castles, beneath the grandeur and echoes of clashing swords, there was a hidden system. Primitive, foul, and absolutely essential. You see, there were no toilets, no polished thrones of porcelain, no flushing mechanisms, no privacy. Instead, there was the garderobe, a simple slab of wood or cold stone with a single hole perched high above the castle's outer wall or suspended over the murky depths of a cesspit. When nature called, lords, ladies, knights, and even servants would squat over this crude invention, letting their waste fall freely into the moat, the forest below, or more commonly into a deep pit beneath the keep. And the smell? It wasn't just bad, it was legendary. The stench would rise through the cracks of the stonework, creeping into chambers, clinging to fabric, and soaking into the very breath of the fortress. But perhaps the worst fate belonged to the gong farmers, the unsung, grim-faced men tasked with cleaning the cesspits. Clad in rough linens and soaked in filth, they entered the pits with buckets and shovels, their skin burning from ammonia fumes, their lungs fighting for every breath. It wasn't just disgusting, it was deadly. Some gong farmers suffocated inside the pits. Others drowned in the thick, putrid sludge, their cries muffled beneath centuries of human waste. Because of the unbearable odor they carried, they were forced to live in isolation, often outside the castle, and only allowed in during nights or designated hours. Their work was crucial. Without them, the buildup could rot through the foundations. But they were treated like ghosts, invisible, untouchable, and always followed by a trail of silent revulsion. In a world obsessed with honor, glory, and divine right, it was the gong farmer who quite literally held the castle together from the bottom up. Water, something we take for granted, was a constant struggle within the stone hearts of medieval castles. There were no flowing taps, no warm showers, no daily scrubs. Instead, water came from deep wells carved into the courtyard, or rain was caught in cisterns and funneled through creaking pipes of wood or poisonous lead if the castle was advanced enough. It trickled slowly, often murky, sometimes contaminated. The concept of cleanliness was far from the modern obsession with hygiene. Most castle dwellers, especially the peasants and servants, bathed only a few times a year, usually during religious festivals or when lice and skin infections became unbearable. And even then, the bath was a crude wooden barrel filled with water that had to be heated manually over a fire and carried bucket by bucket. The process was so exhausting and expensive that it was reserved for the wealthy, and even they didn't do it often. For nobles on the move, bathing was a luxury handled by special servants known as bathmen, who would set up portable tubs during travels and fill them with warm water, sometimes infused with herbs to mask the odor. Inside the castle, a noble's bath was a ritual, slow, deliberate, and ceremonial, but never daily. For everyone else, the alternative was simple: cover the stink. Strong perfumes, oils, and crushed herbs like lavender or rosemary were dabbed onto the skin or sewn into small pouches worn under clothes. Not to smell good, but to smell less bad. It was common for clothes to go unwashed for weeks, sometimes months, and bedding was rarely cleaned. The result? A castle filled with the aroma of old sweat, wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the faintest hint of dying flowers. The smell of medieval power wasn't rosewater and incense. It was boiled sweat, damp stone, and lavender clinging to desperation. If you imagine medieval castles as pristine strongholds of nobility, forget it. They were crawling, quite literally, with life. Not royal life, but the small, skittering kind. Castles were dark, damp, and cold, the perfect habitat for rats, fleas, lice, and all manner of unwelcome guests. The floors were often layered with straw or crushed herbs, not for comfort, but to soak up spills, food scraps, and worse. Over time, those layers would rot, mold, and become breeding grounds for bugs. They were changed occasionally, but never fast enough to prevent the infestation. Rats would run freely across the great halls, kitchens, and bedchambers, chewing through fabric, gnawing on leftover meat bones, and even nesting in the corners of noble chambers. They were so common they became almost invisible, just another part of daily life within the stone walls. The scratching in the walls at night wasn't just legend, it was reality. Some chroniclers described the use of these rodents in the cold lower chambers for punishment or intimidation, a psychological tactic more than anything else. But even outside the dungeons, they were a constant menace. Bed linens crawled with lice, cloaks and tunics itched with unseen invaders, and servants would spend hours picking through hair, hoping to catch what the eye could barely see. To fight the unbearable odors that came with such living conditions, the floors were scattered with mint, lavender, or chamomile, not out of luxury, but desperation. Still, the musty scent of unwashed bodies, moldy straw, animal sweat, and decomposing scraps would cling to the air, no matter how many herbs were crushed underfoot. Every breath taken inside a medieval castle carried with it the weight of rot, rust, and crawling movement. A reminder that beneath the armor and silk, life was constantly under siege. Despite the grime and the gloom, medieval castle life wasn't entirely without hygiene, though by modern standards, it barely scratched the surface. Before meals, it was customary for nobles and guests to wash their hands using stone basins or simple bowls placed near the Great Hall, a ritual more about etiquette than true cleanliness. Water was poured from jugs by servants, often scented with herbs to refresh the skin. As for full body cleaning, that was a rare event, but something as basic as washing one's face or hands with cold water became a quiet form of daily routine for some. Soap, as we know it, wasn't common in Europe until it was brought back from the East during the Crusades. Even then, it was reserved for the upper classes, made from animal fat and scented with herbs. It wasn't pleasant, it was strong, crude, and used sparingly, more to remove layers of visible dirt than to purify. Dental care, on the other hand, was brutal and basic. Toothaches were feared, not just for the pain, but for the lack of solutions. There were no brushes, no paste. People would rub their teeth and gums with rough cloth, sometimes dipped in ashes, crushed herbs, or charcoal, a method that left the mouth scorched but slightly fresher. If pain set in, the only answer was removal, performed with tongues or knives by someone with a steady hand and a high tolerance for screaming. And in a world where many believed that balance in the body meant health, odd solutions thrived. One curious substance used across medieval Europe was collected liquid waste. Believe it or not, it was applied to wounds and fabrics alike, thought to kill harmful elements and brighten colors. While the idea might make us cringe today, it stood in for what we now call antiseptics and detergents. In castles where knowledge met necessity and superstition danced with science, people did what they could and what they believed worked, even if it meant trusting the strangest remedies. Within the same castle walls, two completely different worlds coexisted, one draped in fabric and privilege, the other crawling with labor and cold. The nobility lived in upper chambers known as solars, semi-private rooms with wooden canopies over their beds, windows that let in filtered light, and sometimes even the luxury of a wooden tub for the rare ceremonial bath. Their mattresses were stuffed with feathers or straw, and their clothes lined with fur to soften the chill. They dined on wooden tables under candlelight, shielded from the filth below, or so they thought. Because even the finest rooms couldn't escape the castle's flaws: thick stone walls that trapped dampness, wooden beams that creaked with pests, and the ever-present scent of old smoke, sweat, and unwashed linens. No matter how many perfumes or burning herbs filled the room, the air was never truly clean. Meanwhile, the castle's backbone, the servants and workers, slept in kitchens, storage rooms, or directly on the floor of the Great Hall, wrapped in whatever scraps of wool or animal hide they could find. There was no privacy, no warmth, and certainly no comfort. When fires were out, the cold settled in like a second skin, and waking up meant brushing off frost before beginning another day of endless toil. Nearby, waste from both humans and animals was shoveled into corners, pits, or directly outside, and often left to sit until someone had the time or courage to move it. These scraps, sometimes used in fields as fertilizer, attracted an unrelenting wave of pests that infiltrated both noble and common areas alike. And though the upper class bathed more frequently and had better materials to mask the stink, the structure of the castle, the humidity, the closeness, the lack of circulation, made it nearly impossible to truly escape the grime. Inside the castle, status meant everything, but even velvet and titles couldn't keep the smell of reality from creeping under the door.